Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 5 for our summer class together. We have tonight's session, then we have one more session next week on July 3rd, and then we are done. These summer sessions, 6-week sessions, especially when you only have 5 class sessions, it goes by very, very quickly, and I'm sure you've probably noticed that, and as well as I have. But I do want to welcome you back. Seems like it's been a long time since we've been together, but it's only been 2 weeks. But we'll do a little recap and then we'll get into some of our final information that we are going to cover this evening. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off just to try and avoid any types of bandwidth issues and make sure that I can stay connected throughout the course tonight. So I'm not being rude, just trying to save some bandwidth. So this is our penultimate class. This is our second to last class session. And so what I have on the agenda for tonight is to discuss systems theory and then to wrap up our discussion of the organization theory literature by talking about what I term some more modern theories, even though some of them are not all that modern, but theories such as participative management, quality management. We'll talk about organization culture, one of my personal favorites. And then we'll talk about kind of where the literature has gone in recent years, which is to really focus on leadership and look at the impact of leadership on organizations and organizational effectiveness. So once we cover that information tonight, that will cover all of the theories and all the theorists and schools of thought that we typically cover here in this 660 course. Now, you have already completed 4 of your discussion board posts, 4 of your Canvas essays. The 4th one's due today. And then your 5th and final one is due next week. And for that 5th and final Canvas essay, you will be taking some of the information we cover in the first part of class tonight, looking at systems theory, and then analyzing your organization and the type of system that you think your organization exists within. If you think your organization exists within an open system or a closed system, and then to provide me some examples to illustrate why you think the system may be open or the system may be closed. For the most part, the vast majority of public and nonprofit organizations operate squarely within an open system. There could be some exceptions. And so based upon the information we cover in the first half of class tonight, that will then provide you with the information you need in order to do that 5th and final Canvas essay. Then next week on July 3rd, we will devote the entire session to our presentations. And so we have 13 people in the class this summer, so kind of smaller than normal, but we have 13 folks. And so everyone will do their presentations next week. We'll have already covered all of our information, so it'll all be devoted toward those presentations. And just as a reminder for those presentations, they are brief, informal presentations of your organizational analysis paper. So you'll just be presenting to us what you did in your organizational analysis paper. I am asking that we try and keep the presentations under 10 minutes each if possible, since we have 13 people for next week. If you do the quick math on the back of the envelope, you'll see that if we can keep them all at less than 10 minutes, that takes us beyond about 2 hours with transitions between. We should be able to get to everyone and get the class session over with next week within our allotted time frame. So I will be keeping track of the time for the presentations. And if they start running well beyond 10 minutes, then I might chime in and just, ask you to wrap it up just so we can make sure we can get to everyone. If someone has a desire to go early next week, we want the first people to do your presentations in next week's session. Just send me an email and let me know that, and I'll sign that on a first come, first served basis. Otherwise, we'll just go alphabetically through the roster and everyone will have 10 minutes then to do their presentation. You are certainly free to use PowerPoint or Prezi or whatever type of presentation software you like to use. You are not required to use presentation software. You don't have to have PowerPoint slides. A lot of people like to have those slides just because it serves as a good agenda and kind of keeps people on topic and is a good refresher as you're working through your presentation. But it's completely up to you whether or not you want to use PowerPoint for a presentation. But what I will do then for our class session next week is when we start the session, I will enable screen sharing so that everyone will have the opportunity or the ability to share their screen. And then when it comes your time to present, and I call on you, then you'll be able to, if you have slides, to go ahead and share those slides with the rest of the class. But if you don't want to use slides, that's fine. You're not going to get marked down any points for it. So it's left completely up to you. And then also next week on July 3rd, you then have your organizational analysis paper that is due and the final assessment. So hopefully you have been building the organizational analysis paper throughout our entire time together this summer. And these discussion board posts hopefully will help you build that, and they'll build each section of the paper. As I told you in our first class session together, the way in which I envision these organizational analysis papers is that they're not research papers per se. What I want you to do is take the information, the schools of thought, the theories that we cover here in class, and then apply those theories and schools of thought to your chosen organization. So it's always very important in the organizational analysis paper that you use examples where appropriate to illustrate the points that you are making. And so if you're saying this organization is a theory Y organization, provide some examples of why it's a theory Y organization, a very similar way in which you did in Canvas essay number 4. If you're saying here are the aspects of a Weberian ideal bureaucracy, provide those examples for me as well. So you don't have to do a lot of outside research. You don't have to worry about having, scholarly sources. I'm more interested in your ability to apply the theories to your organization, because that's a very similar type of endeavor that you'll be doing for those of you in the MPA program when you get to 697 directed research and you're doing your organization theory case study. It's the exact same thing that you're going to be doing in that organization theory case study. And then the final assessment will also be due then next Wednesday. And again, the due dates are by midnight next Wednesday, so 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m. For that final assessment, as we've already talked about, you'll be looking at Cal State Long Beach because it's the one organization that we all share. And then answering those 3 prompts I have on the final assessment. Number 1, some examples of some classic organization theories that are exhibited at Cal State Long Beach. Number 2, some examples of neoclassical theories such as human relations, human resource management, or any other neoclassical theories and how they are exhibited here at Long Beach. And then number 3, the system in which the university operates in. Give me some examples of if it's an open system, why it's an open system. If you think it's a closed system, why you think it's a closed system. But that final assessment can be very brief. Be as parsimonious as you can. 3 to 5 pages for that final assessment is probably going to be enough to get the job done. And then same type of thing for the organizational analysis paper. It'll be longer than 3 to 5 pages, but try to be as parsimonious and concise as you can possibly be. So those are the upcoming assignments as we round out our class together, as well as the types of things we'll be talking about tonight and then reserving next week for our presentations. So before I get into our little mini recap of where we are in the class and then move into a discussion of systems theory, are there any questions or clarifications about anything course related? All righty. Very, very good. Then just to kind of recap where we have been in this course, the whole purpose of this course is to kind of give you this tour of the development and evolution of organization theory literature, so that you will then be equipped with the knowledge of these different theories and these different schools of thought, and then have the ability to take these theories and these schools of thought and then apply them to an organization. So that's why the walk away from this class, if you will, that final post-instructional assignment is the creation of that organizational analysis paper. So we began our discussion with the classical school and Weber and Taylor and Fayle and Mooney and Gulick and some of those principles theorists. We talked about how those theories related to each other and then some of the differences between those theories. Then we talked about neoclassical theory, and we discussed neoclassical theories such as human relations theory, human resource management theory, why those schools of thought were developed and how those schools of thought developed as a rejoinder, a response to the classical school and some of its failings. We've also talked about, we will tonight talk about things like systems theory. And when we talk about systems theory, we'll present closed systems theory versus open systems theory. And I'll give you an indication of how those theories work and then why those theories came about to begin with. We had discussed motivational theories that grew out of human resource management theory and the importance of focusing on how we motivate our employees in order to achieve organizational effectiveness. Also tonight, we'll talk about some of those more modern theories and really bring it into the modern period of time, talking about where we are currently in terms of the field of organization theory literature, and talk about some of the pros and cons of some of the more modern theories in the study of organizations. But the entire purpose of studying organizations is to try and reform those organizations into trying to make them more efficient and more effective. And so that's why whenever we complete our discussion of any of these schools of thought, we always return to the Tompkins approach of looking at the competing values framework and asking the question, how do these different theories and these different schools of thought, how do they define and measure organizational effectiveness? Because at the end of the day, we're reforming these organizations, studying them to try and reform these organizations for then the purpose of trying to make them as effective as we possibly can make them. So that's kind of a little recap of where we have been. Tonight, we're going to start our discussion of systems theory. And one of the important things about systems theory is that it really does move us away from the more insulated kind of linear focus on organizations. That when we looked at the classical school, and even when we looked at some of these neoclassical schools, we were looking at the organization. We really weren't talking a lot about or thinking a lot about the role that that organization plays in the bigger scheme of things and where that organization fits within the larger environment. Systems theory asks that question about where does the organization fit in the larger environment. It's a much more holistic way of looking at organizations. Organizations and systems theory, they are viewed as being instruments for the achievement of goals, whether those goals be policy goals or program goals or societal goals. Organizations are the primary instrument that will help us to achieve those goals. So now we're interested in how the organization is operating within a larger environment. So there are two basic approaches to systems theory. There's what's known as natural or closed systems theory, and oftentimes it goes by either term, natural or closed systems theory, versus open systems theory. So a natural closed systems theory perspective, those theorists, such as people like Chester Barnard, view organizations as being living organisms. And I don't want to depress you too much here on a Wednesday evening, but all living organisms, from the moment that they are brought into existence, their primary goal is to try and survive. So organizations, just like living organisms, their primary goal is to try and survive. Throughout the process of their lifespan, from the moment that they are created until the time they go out of existence, those organizations tend to dissipate energy out into their environment. So in natural systems theory, the relationship between the organization and its environment is kind of a one-way street, in that as the organization ages and matures, it will dissipate resources and energy out into its external environment through a process that's known as entropy. So this process of entropy that really is central to natural systems theory says that as an organization ages, it dissipates energy until it gets to the point in time where it has dissipated so much energy and so many resources into the external environment that it no longer has the requisite resources to support itself. And at that point in time, when it has dissipated so much energy into the environment that it can no longer have the resources to survive, that's when organizations, just like living organisms, die and go out of existence. So, with natural systems theory, because we're viewing these organizations as being similar to living organisms, our focus is primarily on the environment internal to the organization. So, what we are looking at with natural systems theory is we are looking at how well the organization is able to regulate its internal processes to survive longer within that external environment. So the better they can regulate their internal processes and hold on to their resources and their energy, the longer those organizations will be able to survive in their environmental context. You can then contrast natural systems theory to open systems theory. They do have some similarities in that now, for the first time, we're starting to take into account the external environment. It's just not the organization in isolation. Now we're looking at the role the organization's playing in a much larger type of environment. But the primary difference between natural systems and open systems theory is that open systems theory looks more at the external as compared to the internal environment. So it looks beyond the walls of the organization. And whereas with natural systems theorists, they saw it kind of as a one-way street, whereas organizations age and mature, they lose resources and energy out to their external environment. Open systems theorists assume that organizations can also import new energies and new resources from their environment to replace those energies that they have dissipated and lost. So it's kind of a two-way street. Not just how does the environment affect the organization, but how can the organization affect its external environment? There are some underlying assumptions that are similar for both the natural closed systems theory as well as open systems theory. One of the similar underlying assumptions is the assumption that systems do not have a concrete existence. And this is an important assumption. If you assume that the system itself does not have a concrete existence, it means that systems are going to change and systems can go out of existence. Environments can lack the ability to support an organization. Sometimes your environment will change in terms of its ability to support the organization. If you have large budget deficits, then those large budget deficits may preclude resources from flowing into the organization. The worse the budget deficits get, the less money goes into the organization, the less likely it is the environment is able to continue supporting that organization. If you're in a nonprofit organization and your organization is very much funded and very much reliant upon grants, in poor economic times, there will be less grant money flowing into your organization, which obviously will have a major impact upon the ability of your organization to survive. So these systems, these environments do not have concrete existence. They are very dynamic and changing in nature. Both natural closed systems theory and open systems theory, their primary goal is to develop these theoretical conceptual frameworks. And the purpose of these frameworks is to try and help us understand the phenomena within our organization as well as the phenomena in the external environment. So they do tend to be relatively conceptual and relatively theoretical in terms of their basis. And both approaches focus really on the interdependence of all the different parts of the system. Now, also, both natural closed systems as well as open systems theory, they both place a very big importance on this concept of equilibrium. According to both natural systems theorists as well as open systems theorists, The primary goal of the organization is to survive. And the best way for the organization to survive is to find this balance, this equilibrium. And this equilibrium is a little different between natural and open systems theories. The equilibrium for natural systems theorists, you're looking at the internal processes within the organization and how well the organization can balance everything that's going on within the walls of the organization. So if you're thinking about an organization as being a living organism, then if you think about like the human body achieves this point of equilibrium when the blood pressure is normalized, when all the vital indicators of health are normal, the body is devoid of diseases. That's when the body is in balance. And that type of equilibrium within the body will obviously help a human being survive longer. And it's the same type of a concept with organizations. So the balance, this equilibrium you're looking for in natural systems theory is an equilibrium within the organization. For open systems theorists, the balance we are looking for, the equilibrium that we are looking for, is the balance between the organization and its external environment. So how well the organization can balance its wants, needs, and desires with the wants, needs, and desires of the external environment. So that's kind of the difference in the focus on equilibrium, but both approaches really do put a big emphasis on this equilibrium, what it's come to be known as the literature as a point of homeostasis. The point of homeostasis is when you have this regulation of your internal structures and processes that then match the characteristics of that external environment. So the goal of these organizations is number one, to survive. And the best way for them to survive is to find their balance point, their point of homeostasis. And that then is the ultimate goal of these organizations under systems theory. But for natural systems theory, as we said, the way you achieve that equilibrium is by looking at the internal processes that are going on within the walls of the organization. For open systems theorists, the way you achieve that equilibrium is by finding that balance point between the organization and its external environment. So the environment can support the organization's survival, and the organization can support the needs in the environment. So let's kind of drill down and look at natural systems theorists and the way in which natural systems theorists approach the study of organizations. Then I'll introduce you to a transitional type of author that helps to push us away from the natural approach and push us more toward the open systems approach, some by the name of Robert Merton, and we call his middle range theories. And then there'll be a really nice segue then into a discussion of open systems theorists, people such as Katz and Kahn. So to start with our natural systems theorists, the one who we talk about most in this course is our good friend Chester Barnard. Chester Barnard we have run into many times in this class, and we're running into Chester Barnard again. We ran into Chester Barnard when we talked about human relations theory. We ran into Chester Barnard again when we talked about motivation theories. Now we're going to encounter him again as we talk about natural systems theory. Chester Barnard is best known for his famous work called The Functions of the Executive. And the argument that Chester Barnard makes is, if you remember back to our discussion of Barnard with human relations, Barnard's contribution to human relations is that in order for managers and their organizations to be effective, that effectiveness is predicated upon the cooperation and the compliance of the individual employees within that organization. So Barnard tells us what we need to do is we need to cooperate with our employees, provide them with the right incentives to then incentivize them to provide contributions to the organization to help the organization achieve its goals and objectives. So it's very much the transactional type of cooperative relationship within our organizations. And so that is what he is most focused on in terms of studying organizations. He says for organizations to survive, organizations need to do a couple of different things. One thing organizations need to do is they need to obtain surplus resources from their environment. The more resources you can have as an organization, the easier time you will have surviving as an organization. And one of the ways that you can get those surplus resources is by getting them directly from the members of the organization, inducing those members of the organization to provide the contributions necessary for the organization to survive. So what Barnard tells us is when we are setting our organizations, we need to look at this relationship between our leaders, our managers, and our employees to make sure that there is a balance between the rewards, the incentives that are being provided to employees, and then the contributions that the organization is able to extract from those employees. So that is that homeostasis. That is that balance point that Barnard looks at with natural systems theory. He says when you look at the incentives that are being provided to employees and the contributions that you're able to extract from those employees, if the contributions you are able to extract from your employees exceed the net dissatisfaction of your employees, then you are being efficient as an organization. And the way in which he views this is whenever you're asking employees to do something, to provide you with contributions, whether those contributions be things such as, like we saw with our discussion of motivation theories, contributions such as your time, your effort, your expertise, your commitment, your collegiality. Those are all contributions that you as an employee are providing to the organization. But the more the organization asks from you, the more likely it is that as an employee, you'll become dissatisfied with the organization, dissatisfied with your position. So as long as the contributions we are getting from employees exceed the net dissatisfaction of those employees, according to Barnard, we are being efficient as an organization. For Barnard, organizational effectiveness was achieving the goals of the organization, and the primary goal of the organization is, again, survival. So if the organization is doing things to help it survive into the future, it is achieving its goals, and that is then the primary indicator of effectiveness for Chester Barnard and natural systems theory. Barnard, as we had talked about when we talked about him before in human relations theory, Barnard tells us that as long as we are not asking people to contribute things that will violate their norms and their values and their ethical principles, there is a pretty good chance that we will get their compliance. There's a pretty good chance that we will get their acquiescence. However, if we do start to ask people to do things that violate their ethical values, that's what's going to then increase the likelihood of employee dissatisfaction. And that's when you're going to see this balance tip away from efficiency and more towards inefficiency. It was this whole idea we had talked about, the zones of indifference. Every employee has a different zone of indifference. As managers and leaders, we need to know what those zones of indifference are for each of our individual employees, and then endeavor not to violate those zones of indifference so that we can keep our employees as satisfied as possible. Obviously, the more satisfied our employees are, the more likely they will be to contribute all these things we need to the organization to help the organization achieve its goal of surviving into the future. So Barnard makes the argument to us that in order to do all of this, in order to achieve this balance, we need to do three primary things as an organization. These are what he calls the roles of the organization's executive. The first role of the executive is to establish an open system of communication. If you want to extract the contributions from your employees that you need to know your employees. You need to know, as Victor Vroom would say, you need to know their expectancies, their confidence level. How confident are they that if they provide this contribution in the form of effort, that they will be able to achieve a certain productivity level. And that if they achieve that productivity level, how confident are they will receive these incentives, these rewards that they have been promised? To know all of that, to know how confident they are, to know what they place a high value on, or as Room calls it, a balance, you need to have that system of communication between your leaders and between your employees. You need to provide the right set of inducements, the right set of incentives to get the buy-in on the part of your employees so that you can extract the right set of contributions from those employees. And then one way, as we know, where our discussion of motivation theory, one way to motivate employees is through Locke's goal setting theory, that we need to establish the goals of the organization, define those goals very clearly, and then going back to point number one, the system of communication, communicate those goals clearly to our employees. But Barnard's view of natural systems theory is very similar to his view of human relations, which is it's a transactional type of relationship between the organization and the employees. And the better you can extract these contributions from your employees, the better you can obtain these surplus resources. And the more surplus resources and contributions you get from your employees, the better chance your organization has to achieve its ultimate goal, which is agency survival. The criticisms of Barnard here with natural systems theory are very similar to the criticisms that we discussed with Barnard in human relations theory. Number one, Barnard really does accept as unquestioned this hierarchical authority that came to us from the classical theorists. So he really kind of accepts this direct supervision, this kind of top-down relationship between leaders and employees, this whole kind of exploitative approach to dealing with employees. It does tend to veer into an anti-democratic type of philosophy because, again, you are not providing these incentives to your employees for the benefit of the employees. You're providing these incentives so you can extract the contributions you need to make the organization survive into the future. And there's very little justification for this type of tight social control over your employees. It's a very centralized, very top-down approach to running an organization. So Chester Barnard in natural systems theory, when we look at our 4 models of organizational effectiveness, I kind of part company a little bit from Tompkins here in terms of those 4 different models. Tompkins will tell us on page 204 that Chester Barnard in natural systems theory emphasizes all 4 of those models of organizational effectiveness. I agree that it emphasizes the human relations model. He is a human relations theorist after all. I agree that it emphasizes the internal process model because we are looking at those processes within our organization and that balance between incentives and contributions. I agree that it emphasizes the rational goal model because it clearly defines the goal of the organization, and the primary goal is organizational survival. Where I part company a little bit with Tompkins is in terms of open systems model. I really don't see nearly as much open systems in Barnard's approach as perhaps Tompkins does. Certainly not nearly as much as you would see with an open systems type of an approach. In terms of your mechanisms for coordination and control, very much oriented around direct supervision. Again, this top-down type of exploitative relationship between managers and employees, and then standardization of values. I do agree there's standardization of worker values here in that if you can find that type of congruence between the values of the organization and the individual, you're not going to violate the zones of indifference of those individual employees, and you'll have a better chance to get the contributions you need from those employees. Motivational strategies, there's a lot of instrumental rewards here, obviously, because we are talking about providing incentives to gain contributions. So there are rewards for performance. There are certainly aspects of considerate leadership because you need to communicate with your employees to know what they value, to know what incentives to provide for them. There's a lot of group acceptance here, like is true with a lot of the human relations theorists. And there's a lot of goal congruence. He tells us we need to be very clear about establishing the goals of the organization. And then the better we can find congruence, we can find a nexus between the goals of the organization and the goals of individual employees, the better chance we have to extract the contributions that we need to make our organization survive into the future. But you can see here with Barnard and natural systems theorists, the reason why it's sometimes called closed system, because the focus is very much within the organization without paying a whole lot of attention to the idiosyncratic characteristics of the external environment. A really good transitional author who can help get us from the world of natural systems theory into the world of open systems theory is Robert Merton. And one of the primary contributions that Robert Merton makes to system school of thought is that he was one of the first people to really start questioning this analogy of an organization as a living organism. That analogy of an organization as a living organism was very much central to Barnard and natural systems theory. Merton argues that they're not really living organisms, and organizations are not necessarily akin to living organisms for several reasons. One reason is that not every activity that an organization engages in is important for the goals of the organization. Not every activity that an organization engages in will help ensure the survival of that organization. There are some things that organizations will do that actually run counter to promoting the survival of the organization. There are some things that organizations will do that are not necessarily rational in nature. If you think about a living organism as a rational, self-interested type of actor that's trying to survive, everything that that organism will do should be done to help that organism survive. Well, not everything organizations do help the organizations to survive. Sometimes organizations will make controversial decisions that will not be looked upon very favorably by elected officials and by budget makers, and can actually have a negative impact upon the survival of that organization. The old adage in public administration is that organizations go out of existence for a couple of reasons. One reason they go out of existence is by not doing a good enough job of accomplishing their mission. The other reason is doing too good of a job of accomplishing their mission. And if they do too good of a job accomplishing that mission and there's really no role left for that organization to play, chances are that organization will get zeroed out in the appropriations process and that organization will go out of existence. Now, there are certainly a lot of examples of organizations that once they have achieved their mission, they then start adopting other missions and start adopting other goals in order to try and survive. One classic example of that from the public administration literature is an organization that was known as the REA. And the REA stood for the Rural Electrification Agency. And the Rural Electrification Agency was just what it sounds like. It was an agency that was meant to try and bring electric service to rural areas across the country. So it had a big role to play, certainly, in the early to mid 1900s, as it was bringing electricity to a lot of rural areas across the country. Once those rural areas basically all had electricity, the REA had actually achieved its mission. But rather than going out of existence, what the REA did is it started to adopt the mission and the goals of some other organizations and really started kind of spreading its tentacles out into the turf of other organizations to try and survive. Because sometimes you do too good of a job achieving your mission, you actually go out of existence. Not every activity that an organization does, according to Merton, is indispensable for survival. There are some ancillary types of things that organizations do that really don't have much bearing at all on the continued survival of that organization. So what Merton does is he shifts our focus away from the focus on the survival of the organization, and he shifts our focus more toward the consequences of the actions of that organization. So instead of just studying organizations to see how they are surviving, Merton argues we should study organizations to see what consequences their actions are having on their beneficiaries, on citizens. So are the programs and the policies and the services and the goods that are being created by this organization, are they serving the wants and the needs of the beneficiaries who are consuming those services? This is kind of the basis of the reinvention of government movement in the 1990s in the Clinton-Gore administration, saying instead of focusing on the organization in terms of survival, let's focus on what the organization is doing and how well the organization is serving what we call then their consumers. So instead of looking at people as citizens, we looked at them as consumers of these goods and services that were being created by the federal government. And so once you start focusing on those consequences, it really does constitute a major shift in the focus of how and why we are studying these organizations. So Merton makes the argument to us that public policies and public organizations will remain in existence as long as the net consequences of these policies and these organizations remain positive. So as long as the organizations are having a net positive consequence on beneficiaries, on citizens, on consumers, those organizations are going to remain. So in order to understand what organizations are doing and how well they are doing and how effective they are, we need to look at the consequences. Kind of instead of just looking at the processes, we have to look at the outcomes that those processes result in. So now we're focusing our attention more outside the organization, focusing our attention on the beneficiaries of these policies, these programs, these services, and these goods. The problem, according to Merton, is that, and we have talked about this before, that as organizations age, as they go through this maturation aging process, they tend to grow in size and they also tend to grow in policies and procedures. They become much more fragmented. They become much more complex in nature. They start promulgating more policies and procedures. Those policies and procedures, those additional policies and procedures can actually lead to an overconformity with the rules. And this is what Merton refers to as one of the primary bureaucratic dysfunctions. One of the primary dysfunctions of organizations is an overconformity with rules. That instead of the goal being to serve your beneficiaries, the goal becomes adhering to policies and procedures irrespective of what that adherence to policies and procedures mean for the effectiveness of the policy for citizens. So an over-reliance upon these rules, this over-conformity with rules, is one of the major bureaucratic dysfunctions that Merton sees in organizations. They kind of lose sight of those constituencies in the external environment outside of the organization. This overconformity with rules then leads to institutional rigidity. And this is something we talked about in a previous class, that as organizations get older, they become more complex, they have more policies and procedures, they become more institutionally rigid. As they become more institutionally rigid, they build these artificial walls between the organization and the stakeholders in the external environment that the organization is supposed to be serving. Those walls that are built between the organization and the people that the organization is supposed to be serving, those walls lead to a lot of conflict between the bureaucrats, the people in the organization, and members of the public. It's these conflicts that lead to what Charles Goodsell told us decades ago, is this very negative view that people have of the bureaucracy. When people say the bureaucracy is too based upon red tape, when they say the bureaucracy is too impersonal, when they say the bureaucracy is too difficult to navigate and too frustrating, those are all artifacts of this overconformity. These are all artifacts of those bureaucratic dysfunctions, according to Robert Merton. So in order to deal with those types of dysfunctions, we need to start looking outside the organization at the stakeholders and how well what we are doing as an organization will be meeting the needs of those stakeholders. So you can kind of see what Merton does. And sometimes Merton, his philosophy is known as a structural functional type of philosophy. But what Merton does is Merton is really starting to push us to look more at that external environment, to look more at those stakeholders in the external environment. And that's what serves as this really nice segue, this really nice transition from the internal focus of natural systems theory to the more external focus embodied within open systems theory. So when you take a look at Merton in terms of those 4 miles of organizational effectiveness, I would agree with Tompkins that all 4 of those models are emphasized in Merton's writing. You've got a human relations approach, you have an internal process model, you have rational goal, and you have open system. In that now you're starting to look at those stakeholders outside of the organization. Your goal has shifted though. Your rational goal now is no longer just agency survival. Now your rational goal is more the consequences of the services you're providing for those stakeholders. For mechanisms for coordination and control of work activities, you'll notice, if you have your book, you'll see on page 232 that none of those are emphasized. And I think that's also very appropriate because it really does depend. It depends upon the types of policies and programs that are being implemented. It depends upon the types of constituents who are benefiting from these policies and these programs. And so it really does depend upon the context of the situation. And the same thing goes for your motivational strategies. It really does depend. It depends upon what types of consequences you're trying to create for your stakeholders, how you will then motivate those employees in order to meet those needs of those external stakeholders. So another thing that Merton kind of adds for our discussion is that it really starts to introduce us to this whole idea of the contextual approach to studying organizations. It's no longer about this one-size-fits-all approach. It's no longer about trying to find the magic silver bullet, this panacea that we can apply in every single situation to every single organization. Now we need to understand the context of the situation and study organizations in a unique way based upon their unique situation, based upon their unique context and contingencies. That really is important because what that underscores for us is it underscores the entire trajectory of the evolution of organization theory literature, moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach, moving more to a more nuanced, contextual, contingency-based approach, which the upshot of that is it means that our study of organizations becomes much more complex and much more difficult because there is no longer one best answer irrespective of the situation. So now, thanks to Robert Merton, we are now starting to look outside the walls of the organization and we're starting to focus on that external environment. Open systems theory picks up on that and really does focus on that external environment, understanding that the way to study organizations is to study the adaptation of the organization to its environment and the adaptation of the environment to the organization. For our open systems theorists like Katz and Kahn, what they introduce us to is this concept known as negative entropy. So for the natural systems theorists, they gave us this concept of entropy. That as organizations age, as they mature, they will dissipate resources and energy out into their external environments until eventually they will no longer have the energy and the resources that they need to continue to survive. And that's when they go out of existence. Open systems theorists say it's not always that one-way street. As organizations mature, yes, they're going to dissipate some energy and resources into the environment, but they can also obtain new energy and resources from that external environment as well. And that's what negative entropy is. Offsetting the resources that you lose with new resources you're able to import from the external environment into your organization. So things such as money, labor pool, um, elected official support, client group, constituent support. Those are all new resources and energy that organizations can focus on bringing into the organization to help them stave off deterioration and help them survive into the future. So the balance here with open systems theory is more of a balance between the organization and its external environment, as opposed to natural systems theory, where the balance was very much internal to the organization itself and a balance of internal processes. Also, with open systems theorists like Katz and Kahn, they also tell us that this achievement of this point of homeostasis, the achievement of this balance between the organization and its external environment, there is not just one way to get there. There are a number of different paths to achieve this final state, the state of homeostasis, this balance with your environment. That idea that there are multiple different avenues and paths to achieve homeostasis is kind of your 25-cent word of the night, and that is equifinality. So the term equifinality just simply means there are a number of different paths that organizations can pursue to achieve this steady state, to achieve this equilibrium, to achieve this point of homeostasis. Again, the two authors who are most commonly associated with open systems theory are Katz and Kahn. Again, they're looking at this two-way street. Not only how do the environmental forces shape organizations, but also how can organizations have an impact upon their environments. So you think about how organizations can impact their environments. Organizations provide services, obviously, and goods to their environment. Organizations, through hiring people who work in the environment, can then obviously have economic stimulus effects on that environment, and that economic stimulus can then have major impacts upon the quality of life and of the median household income of people who live within that community. So there are certainly ways in which the organization can shape its environment and ways in which the environment can shape the organization. Something that grows out of open systems theory, a couple of additional models that grow out of open systems theory are models such as the socio-technical model and the structural contingency model. And again, these are more modern approaches to open systems theory that really grew directly out of the Katz and Kahn open systems approach. Socio-technical theory from Emery and Trist builds upon open systems theory and kind of gives us a place to go when we are looking at the evolution of organization theory literature. When we study classical school of thought, classical school really focused on the technical aspects of the organization. They focus on, with Max Weber, the structure of the organization. With Frederick Taylor, they focused upon the work processes in the organization and finding that one best way to do a job. With people like Fayol and the principles theorists, they focus on the specific skills and techniques that you could teach to your managers to manage the process of work. So with those classical theorists, it's very much technical, very much process oriented. With your neoclassical theorists, your HR theorists, your human resource management theorists, your motivational theorists, and even to a degree, your systems theorists, they really look more at the social aspects of the organization. You know, with the natural systems theorists, you're looking from a social perspective about how you can motivate your employees through the right sets of incentives. So there's a very social dynamic to it. Social-technical theorists say that both approaches can be correct, and they argue for a combination of the technical process approach with the social approach in what they refer to as the approach of joint optimization. Joint optimization in socio-technical theory is about more than just a myopic focus on Frederick Taylor or Elton Mayo. It's really a combination of both the technical work of the organization as well as the social dynamics in the organization too. Then another school that really grew out of the open systems approach and this kind of contingency, contextual approach to study organizations is a school known as the structural contingency school from authors like Burns and Stalker. The structural contingency school makes the argument that, again, there is no one size fits all approach. You have to look at the contingency of the environment, the context that the organization finds itself in. And so, kind of in a similar way to when you took research methods and whatever program you were in, you probably learned about things like regression analysis. And you know that in a multiple regression analysis, we're trying to explain a dependent variable with a combination of independent variables. Well, that's the approach that structural contingency theorists use. For them, their dependent variable is the organization's management system. So, trying to explain why the organization operates the way in which it does, why it behaves the way in which it does, why it makes the decisions that it makes, why it manages itself the way in which it does. That's your dependent variable. That dependent variable is then being affected by a combination of independent variables. Those independent variables are all those different things in the environment. So it could be resource level. It could be the amount of changes that are going on in the environment versus how stable the environment is. It could be changes in the administration, every 4 years. All those things are independent variables, changes in the environment that can then help explain changes in the way in which the organization is managing itself. So if you want to understand organizations under structural contingency theory, you have to understand all these contingencies, all these different elements that affect the management of the organization. So you have to take into consideration such as the environmental uncertainty. So how much uncertainty is there in the environment? So if you have, again, a growing budget deficit and there's less money that's available, or if you're like California and you saw a reduction in anticipated revenue flowing into state coffers, that introduces a lot of uncertainty into the environment. We saw that in the May revise, that people were kind of waiting with bated breath for that May revise to see how much revenue we were actually going to get as a state, and then what are the implications of getting less revenue than what we thought we were going to get back in January when the governor's budget was first prepared. So again, that's just one example of that uncertainty, but it could be political uncertainty. Any type of uncertainty in the environment can have an impact, obviously, upon the organization. Another element that affects the management of the organization is technology. The type of technology being used by the organization and the rapid growth and change in technology can have an impact upon those organizations as well. We see that in terms of cyber threats and having to protect ourselves from hackers. And we see all these cyber ransoms that are being paid by organizations. That's going to affect the way in which organizations manage their information, how they manage their online presence. The rise of artificial intelligence and things like ChatGPT will be having major impacts upon public organizations, and how we leverage and use that technology will certainly affect the behaviors and the way in which we act as an organization. The size of the organization can have an impact upon how that organization manages itself as well. When we talked about our good friend Mary Parker Follett, we talked about the idea of interpenetration of ideas and integration as a way of dealing with conflict. We said that, admittedly, that works very well if you're in a small, very flat hierarchical organization. It doesn't work as well if you're in a massive organization that is very barbarian in terms of its hierarchy. So size can have a big impact. The strategy of the organization can have an impact, obviously, as well. Your mission, your goals, your objectives, the action plans that you put together to help you achieve your organization goals can obviously have a big impact upon what that organization does on a daily basis. Leaders obviously will have an impact upon that strategy for the organization as well. So if you have a lot of turnover in leadership, that will affect that strategy, will then affect, in turn, the behavior of the organization. Resource dependency. How dependent is the organization on resources from the external environment? Where do they get their resources from? Do they get the resources primarily from appropriations? Do you get the resources primarily from grants? Are they a government corporation that will get the resources primarily from the quote unquote profits that they get from selling goods and services? The more dependent you are on resources from your environment and the more unstable those resources are, obviously that can have an impact upon your ability to engage in risk taking and being more creative and innovative in the types of things that your organization will do. When we talked about differences between public and private organizations, we said one of the primary differences is in public organizations, you have this reliance upon relatively stable appropriations. In private organizations, you have a reliance upon profits, which are very unstable and very difficult to predict. And then public accountability. How transparent you have to be as an organization depends upon the demands on public accountability. One thing that a lot of organizations are struggling with today, and it's something your organization may be dealing with, is responding to a myriad of public records requests. Here in California, we have a very permissive Public Records Act, and it's very easy for people to submit public records requests. They can do it via email. They're not required to fill out a form. And sometimes those requests are somewhat overly broad. And the more broad those requests are, the more difficult they are for organizations to respond to. Organizations typically have 10 days to respond to those public records requests. If it's a very broad request that's going to require a lot of work and a lot of documentation, you can then, within those 10 days, just say you're going to need some extra time to produce that material. But all those public record requests will change what the organization's doing on a daily basis. There are opportunity costs that are associated with having employees track down all this information to satisfy and be responsive to those public records requests. They are very, as Carl said, they are very time consuming, and they're even more time consuming based upon the California Supreme Court, which has also said that the types of the way in which you need to be responsive really opens it up to a lot of different types of communication. And so I know when I was on the board, if we received any district communications on our personal cell phone, those were all discoverable in a public records request. And so with those being discoverable in a public records request, it means that you would have to go to all your board members, all your employees, and then ask them for anything that is responsive to this request in any of these emails or any of these text messages. And that could take a very, very long time and certainly can be very time consuming and have very high opportunity costs. You think about in terms of public accountability as well, the responsibility of making your deliberations open to the public. And by making your deliberations open to the public, it could mean that you're going to have a lot of your time within your city council meeting that's going to be devoted to public comments. And so that also will maybe delay some of the work of the government. So, just some examples of some of these elements and the environment that can certainly have a big impact upon the management of the organization. Again, the basic idea here is that it is contingency based, in that we really have to look at the contingency in which the organization's operating in. We really have to understand the unique idiosyncratic details of the environment and then use that to help us predict why our organizations are behaving in the way in which they are behaving. And yeah, Paul, public comments certainly do take a lot of time in city council meetings. I know they took a lot of time in our school board meetings. And it seemed like every year I was on the board, public comments, we had more and more public comments. And then it really became difficult during COVID, because during COVID, then everyone was remote. And then you had to try and manage public comments in a remote manner. And it became a logistical nightmare to have to do public comments. But it's important. It's obviously important for the public to be able to be present and to be participating in these meetings, but it does really change the very nature of the meetings themselves. So when we look at open systems theory and structural contingency theory in terms of our models for organizational effectiveness, obviously it's the open systems model. It just goes, it's commonsensical, it goes without saying. That's the name of the school. It's very much open systems in nature. We're looking at the characteristics of that external environment, how the environment affects the organization, how the organization then affects its environment. Mechanisms for coordination and control, again, none are really emphasized because it's going to depend upon the situation itself. Motivational strategies, again, none are emphasized because it will depend upon the context of the situation, which motivational strategy will be used at a given point in time by a given organization. So that kind of in a nutshell is open systems theory and kind of the progress from natural systems theory to kind of this Merton structural functional approach, and then the transition into open systems theory, and then some of the newer schools of thought that were kind of generated out of open systems theory. Now, as we said, the vast majority of public organizations and nonprofit organizations tend to operate within much more of an open as compared to a closed system. How open that system is will obviously depend upon the state that you are in. Here in California, it tends to be a very open system. In some other states, it's a little bit more closed in that there aren't quite as many avenues for the public to participate in local governance. But I think for the most part, the vast majority of our organizations find themselves within these open types of environments. So it's important to go beyond just the walls of the organization and understand this interplay and this balance and relationship between the organization and its external environment. We're not going to do this group exercise right now because I do want to make sure that we have enough time tonight to get through all of our other theories. So we've covered all of the theories we normally cover in this class. So we're going to hold off on these breakout groups right now. We may circle back to them depending upon how long it takes us to cover our other theories. But for now, we're going to kind of hold off on those. So that's systems theory. Are there any questions, clarifications, comments on systems theory? Okay. If not, then we're kind of at a nice breaking point right now between our discussion of systems theory and the beginning our discussion of some of the more modern theories to round out our material for this semester. So I propose let's go ahead and take a break at this point. Let's take a break until we'll say, see what time it is, 7:06. Let's take a break until 7:20 because we're sorry, 7:07. So we'll take a break until 7:20. Come on back at 7:20, and then we'll get into some of these more modern theories. We'll talk participative management, we'll talk quality management, we'll talk organization culture, and then we'll wrap up the entire show talking about kind of where the literature is now and its focus on leadership and the impact of leadership on the management and study of organizations. And so it's what we'll do when we come back at 7:20. So enjoy your break, and I'll see you back here in a few minutes. Okay, everyone, it is 7:20, so we are back from break. Let me save a little bandwidth here. So where I kind of like to wrap up the class is looking at some of the more modern theories that have flowed out of some of the previous theories that we've talked about over the past 4 or 5 weeks together. And so, again, as I told you, there are 4 different schools of thought we'll talk about here in the second half of class tonight. Won't spend a whole lot of time on them, but as always, we'll talk about the theories and then we'll link them up to the 3 different ways in which we've linked up all the theories throughout the entire course. So this first more quote unquote modern theory, and again, we use that term loosely because more modern could be something 30 years ago or 40 years ago, or it could be the current state of the literature. But one more modern theory we cover in this class is what's called participative management. And that is a term that you're familiar with because it comes out of Mary Parker Follett and all the way back in the 1920s. But some authors who were big believers in Mary Parker Follett really kind of coined this term several decades later, known as participative management. With participative management, there are several authors associated with that theory, but we're only going to look at a few of them just for the sake of time and scope of the class. Some of the authors in this participative management school are people like Lewin, Lippitt, and White. And these are authors who are best known for the University of Iowa Leadership Studies. So in the world of organization theory, sometimes you'll hear about the Iowa studies. And when you hear about the Iowa studies, this is what they're referring to, the leadership studies, the University of Iowa. The idea behind the leadership studies at the University of Iowa was to try and determine what impact the extent of allowing participation on the part of members of a group, what impact that then had on the productivity and the effectiveness of that group. So what we're really doing is we're challenging those old assumptions under the classical school of people like Weber and Taylor and the principles theorists. So essentially what the Iowa studies did is the authors split up students into what they called autocratic groups and democratic groups. And the idea was to see if democratic group students work better and work more effectively than autocratic group students. So in the democratic groups, the leaders of those democratic groups allowed the students in those groups to participate, allowed them to make decisions for the group, and basically just kind of guided the discussions rather than taking this top-down centralized approach, no direct supervision. It was more just kind of guiding and facilitating the discussion in those democratic groups. Then they created autocratic groups. In those autocratic groups, it was just the opposite, where the leaders of those groups took a very classical approach to running those groups, a very top-down type of centralized direct supervision type of an approach. The studies, the Iowa studies, really only were designed to focus on those two different types of groups, democratic groups versus autocratic groups. But during the study, something happened to one of the democratic groups. In one of the Democratic groups, the leader of that group really took very much of a hands-off type of approach, where literally just kind of left the group to its own devices, provided no facilitation, provided no mentoring, no feedback. That wasn't the way in which it was supposed to run, but because that leader of that group did that, that group then became known as the laissez-faire group. So kind of unintentionally, there became three different groups in the study: the Democratic group, the autocratic group, and the laissez-faire group. The group that was the least successful was the laissez-faire group. So the laissez-faire group, where the leader just left people to their own devices, didn't give them any guidance or any facilitation, those groups got absolutely nothing done. It was kind of a colossal failure. So you can't have a completely hands-off approach. For the autocratic groups, the members of those autocratic groups really felt that they were not being valued, they were not being heard, they were having their path to goal attainment being blocked by the leader. They felt that they had lost stature, that they weren't really being valued, and their opinions weren't being valued. So much so that in some of those autocratic groups, the students actually became violent against the leader of the group. And it actually became a very controversial type of relationship between the students of the autocratic group and the leader of those autocratic groups. Obviously, the group that worked most effectively and most productively was the Democratic group. That even those Democratic groups, when the leader would leave the room, the students would continue to work collegially as a group, and those are the most effective and most productive groups. I don't think we're terribly surprised by that, but it really is very much a more modern testing of the Mary Parker Fowler approach back from the 1920s. This recognition of the enhanced effectiveness of the democratic approach as opposed to the autocratic approach led an author by the name of Rensis Leiker to develop his approach to participative management, whereby he argued that there are actually four different types of possible management systems in an organization. The first type of management system, according to Leiker, is the exploitative authoritative system. This would be a system very similar to those autocratic groups. That's a system very similar to the classical theorists like Weber and Taylor. The second possible management system, according to Leiker, is a benevolent authoritative system. In a benevolent authoritative system, the decisions are still primarily being made at the top of the organization, and then those decisions are being handed down in very much of a direct supervisory type of manner. but it's being done in a way in which you're not exploiting the employees, you're talking to the employees, you're providing considerate leadership to those employees, a much kinder, much more benevolent type of top-down management system. Then the third type of system, according to Leiker, is the consultative system. The consultative system is where you talk to your employees, you ask them about their experiences, you include them in the discussion, but the decisions are still primarily being made at the top of the organization. So you consult with people, but you go ahead and make the decisions anyway at the level of leadership. The fourth type of management system is the participatory or participative type of management system, where people actually do participate in self-governance and participate in their own decision-making. And obviously, Leiker makes the argument that it's that participative management type of an approach that is the most effective way of running and managing our organizations. And yes, this is the same Leiker you're probably familiar with from your research methods courses. Whenever you did surveys and survey construction, you talked about the use of Leiker ordinal response categories. It's the same person. But here he's arguing for the use of this type of participative management, allowing people to participate in their own governance, much along the lines of Mary Parker Follett. So in order to carry out participative management in an organization, obviously you need to, number one, establish the supportive workplace relationships between employees and employers. You need to allow groups to engage in decision-making. You need to allow people within those groups to have decision-making authority. So a delegation of that decision-making authority down throughout the organization. Very much more what, again, Follett would have referred to back in the 1920s as a democratic type of organization. Participative management obviously is much more of a human relations type of approach, focusing on the internal processes within the organization, still having the goal of the organization as being effectiveness as the primary objective of any organization. A lot of mutual adjustment in terms of the mechanisms for coordination and control, very much like human resource management. And then for your motivational strategies, a lot of considerate leadership, a lot of group acceptance, and a lot of job identification, allowing people to participate in deciding what types of jobs they're going to be doing on a daily basis and the content and composition of those jobs. Again, very similar then to Douglas McGregor and Chris Ardress, who we talked about when we talked about human resource management. So participative management is kind of just a modification and a refinement of human resource management that we had talked about a couple of weeks ago. Then a second type of theory that really became very popular, especially in the 1960s and the 1970s in the management of organizations, is this approach known as quality management. Quality management is most closely associated with Deming as the primary author. And in quality management, we are going to define the effectiveness of the organization as the quality of the product that's being created by that organization. So there's a little bit of Merton here in that we're looking at the output that's being created, and hopefully if we're creating a quality output, then that quality output will then have the desired outcomes, the desired consequences for the people who are consuming that quality output. Now, obviously, if you are a large organization, excuse me, and you are creating a lot of outputs on a daily basis, you're not going to be able to measure the quality standards of every single output that you are creating. So instead, we're going to employ some sampling design. We're going to employ some of the designs that we're familiar with from our research methods courses. So one of the approaches used in quality management is what's called statistical process control. So instead of looking at every single output, every single product that's being created on a daily basis, we will instead take a simple random sample of all those outputs. We will then measure the quality of that random sample of those outputs, and we will then generalize and extrapolate those results to all the outputs that we're creating as an organization. Now, as you know from research methods, The ability to extrapolate and generalize the results from a sample to a target population will be based upon how well you have put that sample together and how representative that sample of outputs really is for the target population of all the outputs being created by the organization. That's what we know as external validity in the research world. So we want to make sure that we have external validity. We have the ability to generalize those quality standards to everything that we are creating, even if we are not measuring every single output, every single product that's coming out of our organization. The idea behind quality management is if we can control the entire production process. So if we can build quality into the process, then that quality process will result in a quality output. The whole idea of quality management and statistical process control was something that Deming championed to US corporations in the 1960s and really met with a lot of resistance. A lot of US corporations weren't interested in quality management. So rather than keep banging his head against the wall, Deming decided to take his theories to Japan. So he took statistical process control and quality management to Japan, found a much more receptive audience with Japanese corporations. Japanese corporations started implementing quality management. And then because of the success that those corporations were having with quality management, then US corporations started asking, why are the quality levels of these things like, the steel coming out of Japan, cars that are coming out of Japan, why are those quality levels so much higher than the quality levels of the cars and the steel being produced in the US? And the answer was, it's the adoption of quality management. So at that point, that's when US corporations started adopting statistical process control and started adopting quality management. Once the private sector started adopting quality management, it wasn't long then for public organizations to start adopting quality management as well. And when it was adopted by public organizations, it started to be adopted as what's called TQM, Total Quality Management. And perhaps in your organization, if you've been in your organization long enough, you may have lived through the total quality management movement. It's still going on today in a lot of organizations. I know that here at Long Beach, there's very much a movement to try and make all online courses quality matters certified courses. That's kind of a total quality management type of an approach for online education. But total quality management, as it was implemented, especially in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s in public organizations, was predicated upon the following. Total quality management, number one, was predicated upon a customer focus, very similar to Robert Burton and his idea of let's focus on the consequences for beneficiaries. Let's focus on our customers. Rather than referring to people as citizens, they refer to as customers or consumers. As I had said before, this is that focus that we saw in the reinvention of government from Osborne and Gabler in the 1990s during the Clinton administration. So we focus on customers and we see how well the products that we are creating as an organization are meeting the needs of those customers. Secondly, total quality management is predicated upon the total involvement of employees. So you involve all the employees who are working toward the creation of this product. They are all involved in this quality enhancement process. There is an approach in total quality management known as the use of quality circles. So with a quality circle, you will look at the production of a good and you'll ask the question, who are all the employees who are involved in the production process for this good? All those people who are involved at all in the production process, they all become part of that quality circle, and they then work together, are empowered to work together to build quality into the process of the creation of that output. It's a very process-centered type of orientation in that we are building quality into the process, which will then hopefully result in a quality output. Several years ago, a US auto manufacturer, I think it was Ford maybe, who always said it's quality is job one. And they talked a lot about building quality into the process of building their trucks, which would then lead to a quality truck. Integration of functions. In total quality management, we are integrating the functions for everyone who is involved in the product, in the creation of this product. In the process of creating the output, everyone is involved. All their functions are all integrated together. It's a very strategic and systematic approach. If you can build a quality system, the quality system in theory will result in a quality product. There is a feedback loop that is inherent within total quality management as well. So if you do find some deficiencies in the quality of the product, that information then gets fed back into the process and the design of that product so that you can have this continuous improvement type of a process, this kind of plan, do, check type of continuous improvement process. Decision making is based upon facts. It's based upon empirical evidence, kind of like with Max Weber. We will base all our decisions in total quality management on facts, this evidence that we are creating by measuring the quality of the products and then feeding that evidence back into the production process. And in order to have that feedback mechanism, that feedback loop, you need to have an open, free-flowing communication system. And that's what became known as total quality management. And as I said, through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, a lot of public organizations really spent a lot of time and a lot of money trying to implement total quality management within their organizations. Giron is another author who contributes to the quality management school. And Giron contributes through his 3 different factors of quality planning, quality control, and quality improvement. Giron makes the argument that even before we look at the process of creating this good, we have to plan for the creation of the goods. We have to make sure that we have the right resources, we have the right people in place, we have the right training and the right skills. We have to do quality planning before we can have a quality process. That quality process can only be a quality process if you have quality control. So you need to make sure that you have some quality control mechanisms in place to measure the quality of those products that you are creating, and then have that feedback loop to then build back into the production process, planning and process, that information to allow you to improve the quality of the good that you are producing. Now, it all sounds very commonsensical, sounds very linear and very straightforward, but when total quality management was implemented in the public sector, we recognize that there are some unique obstacles that need to be overcome in the public sector to make quality management work as well and as effectively as it worked in the private sector. And some of the obstacles you have to overcome in the public sector are things such as the structural fragmentation that is inherent within our public organizations. As we know, power and authority within public organizations is oftentimes very fragmented. Leaders and managers don't have the same control over employees in the public sector that they have in the private sector. In the private sector, you have employees who are at-will employees. So they work at the will of the organization. It's much easier for you to discipline and to terminate at-will employees than obvious it is for a civil service employee. So when you're dealing with civil service employee and you're dealing with a civil service employee that is also part of a public employee union, you have much less control over what those employees do and governing those employees. So the power is much more fragmented within public organizations. The structures in public organizations also tend to be much more fragmented as well as compared to the private sector. A lack of incentives is a second obstacle to quality management in the public sector. We don't have the same ability to provide monetary extrinsic rewards as we talked about when we talked about motivational theory a couple of weeks ago. We don't have those same options at our disposal in the public sector. A lot of total quality management is predicated upon the providing of these types of monetary extrinsic types of rewards. Third obstacle is high turnover in leadership. In the public sector, we do have high rates of turnover at the top levels of leadership in a lot of our public organizations. This is especially true when you have public agencies and public and departments that are headed up by political appointees. Those political appointees may have a tenure of 12 months or 18 months or 24 months. They're gone relatively quickly. And the more turnover you have in leadership, the more difficult it is to implement total quality management. Think about it as well as a local government level. When you look at a reform government, which is a government that has a city manager, those city managers oftentimes do have relatively short durations to their tenure. They are hired by city council and they operate at the pleasure of city council. They serve at the pleasure of city council. It's not unusual for a city manager to run afoul of city council's wishes and not have their contract renewed after a year or two. And so we do have a lot of turnover in leadership in the public sector. Fourth obstacle to overcome are these statutory barriers. A lot of what we do, obviously, as you all know, when you're implementing these public programs and these public policies, a lot of what you do is going to be dictated by the enabling legislation, by statute. So we're much more limited in our ability to tell employees, be creative and go out there and do all these different things and be innovative. If it runs afoul of statutory requirements, then everybody is in trouble. So those statutory barriers are an obstacle. The fifth obstacle is the resistance among many public managers to giving up power and authority. When your power and authority is already strictly limited in a public organization, it's difficult for you to then delegate further power and authority to employees within those quality circles. So there is very much of a hesitation and resistance for public managers to give up what little power and authority they may have that they can then have over their employees. Lack of resources. We know that we're always asked to do more with less in the public sector. And that is something that is certainly going to be true for the next few years here in the state of California. It's certainly true at the federal level as the budget deficit continues to increase and the national debt continues to grow. There will be fewer resources that are available. Lack of resources means that you can't incentivize things and you really don't have the resources to put in to the process itself. And you're oftentimes just using your resources to put out fires and you don't have the time to put the resources to put into the process improvement. Conflicting goals. We know that a lot of the goals that we have for our policies and our programs come to us from legislative bodies. Sometimes we have conflicting goals whereby the executive wants one thing done, the legislature wants something else done, and even now today, the courts want a third type of thing done. So once you have those conflicting goals, it's very difficult for you to identify these measures of quality that you'll implement into your process and your outputs. And lack of performance measures. As we talked about when we talked about goal setting theory a couple of weeks ago with Locke, if you don't have clear, well-articulated goals, it's going to make it very difficult for you to have clear, well-articulated measurements for performance. And we don't have those very empirical, very objective performance measurements in the public sector that you may have in the private sector. If your primary goal is to, with this program, you're going to enhance the quality of life of a citizen, measuring the enhancement of quality of life is obviously a much more qualitative, much more subjective type of outcome than what you may have with your widget factory over in the private sector. So when you have a much more qualitative, much less quantitative types of outputs, it's more difficult then for you to apply quality management in the public sector. But despite all of that, quality management did enjoy somewhat of a heyday in the public sector, even though we had all these types of obstacles to overcome. In terms of our 4 miles of organizational effectiveness, the School of Quality Management really emphasizes all of them because it's really going to very much depend upon how that quality is being measured in those outputs, what members, what stakeholders in the external environment are being served by these outputs, and so on and so on. Since you are building quality in the process by involving employees in these quality circles, you are engaging in mutual adjustment in terms of working directly with these employees and empowering them to make some decisions. And you've got a lot of standardization. You're trying to standardize the work outputs. That's the primary goal of quality management. You want to standardize worker skills. You also want to standardize work processes. So I kind of part company with Tompkins there. I would highlight the standardization of work processes with quality management, as well as the standardization of values. So there's a lot of standardization in terms of quality management. There's also, in terms of motivation, a lot of considerate leadership, group acceptance, job identification, and goal congruence. But again, there are a lot of obstacles we have to overcome in using quality management in the public sector. And I think we found out what a lot of those obstacles were. And some of those obstacles were just too high of a burden to surmount. And I think that's why a lot of public organizations have foregone a focus on total quality management. However, a third more modern theory that I think is certainly alive and well, both in the organization theory literature as well as in our public organizations today, is this school of organization culture. I'm a big fan of the school of organization culture because it recommends to us that we have to study organizations differently depending upon their own unique cultures. So the school of organization culture that comes to us from people like Sheen will make the argument that every organization has its own unique culture. And to study an organization, to understand an organization, how it structures itself, how it behaves, what it does on a daily basis, how it treats its employees, we must first understand that unique culture within that organization. So my basic question to you is, give me a definition of culture. What do we mean when we use the word culture? What does culture mean to you?
I, I can you hear me okay?
Sure can. Yeah, go ahead.
To me, culture, especially organizational culture, is kind of like the shared values of the organization or the tempo. I mean, normally I say cultural norms. I don't know how else to articulate it, but it's kind of the identity of the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I would agree with that. Absolutely. Very well said. Paula, go ahead.
I agree with that, and also like sometimes it is at least expressed through like methodologies, the way that things are done. There's a particular way things are done that sometimes is indicative of the culture. Like if some places are very regimented about following rules, having procedures for everything, versus some other places that may be more like free flowing and spontaneous.
Right. Absolutely. And, when we're looking at culture, we're looking at those values, those shared values. We're looking at the norms, the expectations. And you're exactly right. Those shared values, those norms, those expectations will certainly dictate the processes and the methodologies that we use as an organization. As Francis says, the general mindset of the team, these shared values, this general mindset is something that is shared by members of the organization. Sometimes we talk about these values, sometimes we don't talk about these values. Sometimes they're explicit, sometimes they're more implicit. But I do think Paul makes a really important connection, is that these types of shared values and these norms and these expectations really do guide the behavior of the organization. So I think every organization does have its own set of shared values and norms and expectations. Just like we have societal cultures, we have political cultures. You can make the argument here in the US, we have a political culture that certainly looks different than a political culture in maybe Saudi Arabia or in another country. So these unique shared expectations and values and norms make up what we expect in terms of the behaviors of people within those organizations. Sheen makes the argument that we have to understand those shared values and norms and expectations before we can really truly study an organization. And he makes the argument that there are three different levels to an organization's culture. There are what he calls artifacts, what he calls espoused values, and what he calls basic assumptions. So in terms of artifacts, artifacts are visible parts of the organization. They are tangible, visible parts of the organization that we can, as an outsider, study to learn about that organization and the daily life of that organization. So it'd be kind of similar to if you were an archaeologist and you go on archaeological dig trying to learn about an ancient society, you're going to dig up eating utensils. Those are artifacts that will help you learn about the daily activities of the daily behaviors of that ancient culture. In organizations, we have artifacts as well. We have the agendas for meetings that we hold. We have the minutes that are produced as a record of those meetings. We have organization structures. We have our organization chart, and we have all of our position classification system, all of our position descriptions. Those are all very tangible, visible measurements of an organization's culture. They're just like artifacts in an archaeological dig. They're very shallow, they're very easy to find, they're very easy to assess and analyze. At a deeper level, a more hidden level, you then have what are called espoused values. Espoused values are organizational goals. They can be the mission statement of the organization, the vision statement of the organization, the strategic plan of the organization that articulates here are the goals of the organization, here are the action plans that will help us achieve those goals. Those are the espoused values. They are discussed by the organization. They are presented to both the internal as well as external world by the organization. So they are also relatively easy to access, relatively easy to study. When you're doing an analysis of an organization, you're going to look at their mission statement. What's the organization all about? You're going to look at their most recent strategic plan. Those are those espoused values of the organization. Then at the third level, the much more hidden level, are these basic assumptions. These are basic assumptions that we as members of the organization all share about how we treat each other, for example. So we all assume that we are going to treat each other with civility in a collegial manner. That's something that we all assume that will guide our behavior. We don't talk a whole lot about it unless we have a written civility code, and some organizations today have a written civility code. I was just participating last semester. I'll be doing it again the upcoming semester at revising what's called the RTP document, which is the retention, tenure, and promotion document for faculty. And there is a part of that document that calls for civility between faculty members. And that's something that can be taken into consideration when someone goes up for tenure and promotion. It's something that we felt necessary. We actually had to articulate. For years, it was a basic assumption. We didn't talk about it, but we all assumed that we would treat people in a civil manner. Unfortunately, we've actually had to write that down. So it's kind of moved more from a basic assumption to more of an espoused value, at least in our college and at the university. But basic assumptions we usually don't talk about, but they will guide the way in which we expect to be treated and the way in which we expect to treat others. So as we are studying the culture of an organization, from artifacts to espoused values to basic assumptions, as we dig deeper, it becomes more difficult for us to access that information. But all three of those levels of organization culture are something we need to study as we study organizations. Now, we also know that leaders can embed culture into their organizations. So when a leader comes into an organization, they can embed a new culture into that organization. And there are some specific ways, as Sheen tells us, that you can embed culture into an organization. There are primary embedding mechanisms, and then there are what he calls secondary embedding mechanisms. So in terms of your primary embedding mechanisms, one primary embedding mechanism is what leaders pay attention to, what they measure, and what they control. So when leaders put forth a lot of effort and a lot of resources to measuring a certain type of behavior, that is a direct signal to employees that this is something that is important to not only the leader, but also important to the organization. So it signals that this is an important part of the organization's culture. How leaders react to critical incidents and crises. Organizations go through crises frequently, especially in the public sector. It seems like we're always putting out fires. How our leader responds to that crisis will also signal the culture of the organization. So, is there a consistent way in which leaders respond to crises again and again? That will then tell you a bit about the culture and the expectations of the organization. The observed criteria by which leaders allocate scarce resources. So these resources, these incentives that we are providing the organization, what type of criteria are used to dictate how those incentives and how those resources are being given out? Deliberate role modeling, teaching, and coaching. This takes us back in our motivational theories to social learning cognitive theory, that leaders can role model and they can coach employees to understand the types of behaviors that are valued by the organization. Again, as we said, the observed criteria by which rewards are allocated, the observed criteria by which leaders recruit, select, and promote employees. That also can be a pretty direct primary embedding mechanism. Then there are secondary embedding mechanisms, things such as the design of the organization, the structure of the organization is a secondary embedding mechanism. So the leader comes in and presents a new structure to the organization that embeds culture. So they may come in and they may introduce a flatter hierarchy into the organization. That signals to employees, obviously, that the culture is now oriented around participation, exchange of ideas, collegiality, etc. The processes and procedures and systems that are implemented within the organization also can then embed culture and signal employees what is important to the culture of the organization. The design of physical space is also an important embedding mechanism. And so if you want people to work on a more collegial type of basis, you may want to remove some of these walls from the offices. You want to have maybe shared workspaces where people can work together in this more collegial type of an approach. And we learned as far back as the 1960s how important the design of physical space was to the behavior of people who occupy that physical space. And if you're familiar with the urban affairs literature, especially when it comes to urban public housing, one of the most famous public housing projects was what was called Pruitt-Igoe. And the Pruitt-Igoe housing project was notorious for how non-user friendly it was for residents. And so in the Pruitt-Igoe housing project, you had things such as, in order to save money, the elevators did not stop at every single floor because, that would save wear and tear on the elevators and essentially make the elevators operate more quickly. And so you would have some elevators that would only stop on even numbered floors. So if you lived on an odd number floor, you would have to get off. If you lived on the ninth floor, you'd have to get off on the eighth floor and walk up a flight of stairs, get off on the 10th floor and walk down a flight of stairs. Those types of things are not really very conducive to people enjoying where they're living. And the less they enjoy where they're living, the less they respect where they're living, less likelihood that they will put forth effort to, taking care of the place in which they are living. And so things like that, just physical design of space can have an impact upon people's behavior. In my district, one of the things that we did in our finance department, because we were having some problems in terms of employee morale in the finance department, is we realized that people were very balkanized in the finance department. They were all located up on the second floor of the district office, and they were all working in individual offices, and there wasn't a whole lot of interaction that was going on. And so we redesigned the physical space to create some of those shared workspaces in order to try and make that the more shared assumption of working together as an organization. Stories, legends, myths about people and events. Every organization has its own urban legends and its own urban myths. Those urban legends, those urban myths can certainly embed culture into the organization. And then your statements of organizational philosophy and values. by changing those organization philosophy statements and value statements. That's another way in which you can embed culture into the organization. So organization is certainly something that is not static. It is something that is dynamic, and it's something that can be embedded by leaders. The problem for leaders is when a new leader comes into an organization and wants to embed culture into that organization, it might take a lot of political capital, and they might burn through a lot of political capital in embedding that culture into the organization. So yeah, I like organization culture because it really feeds in very well to my favorite answer in this class and every class in public administration, which is it depends. Studying the organization will depend upon the culture of that organization. We must first study the culture of the organization, understand that culture before we can understand why the organization behaves in the way in which it behaves. Organization culture emphasizes all four of our models of organizational effectiveness. We certainly have human relations, internal process, rational goal, and open systems, because the culture will dictate how we deal with not only employees within our organization, but stakeholders outside of our organization, and so on. In terms of our mechanisms for coordination and control, there's standardization of values. We are certainly trying to standardize values so everyone shares similar values and similar expectations for how people should behave and interact within the organization. Motivational strategy, hopefully we are motivating people through goal congruence. That if everyone is sharing the same goals and they're sharing the same expectations, the same values, we have that congruence where we're all working together toward the same goal, the same outcome. So yeah, I really do like organization culture, and I really would recommend that as you look at your organization, think about what is the culture of your organization and what are some of the embedding mechanisms that you have seen leaders use to embed culture into your organization. Where the organization literature is today is in terms of a focus on leadership. The literature really has started looking back at how people lead organizations and studying how leaders lead their organizations as the way in which we study those organizations and organizational effectiveness. Now, a focus on leadership is interesting because it's kind of been this ebb and flow in leadership studies in the organization theory literature. Organization theorists become very interested in leadership, and then they'll kind of become disinterested in leadership. And then leadership will have a reemergence, and then it'll go out of vogue again, and then it will come back again. It's now currently in modern organization theory literature is really enjoying a renaissance, if you will. We've seen that renaissance through what we've already discussed with participative management, and Lewin and Leiker really did focus on democratic leaders versus autocratic leaders, and so really had that very much of that leadership type of focus to it. The traditional approach that organization theorists have taken toward understanding leadership was what we call a trait-based approach. The trait-based approach assumed that there were certain characteristics that people had that made them into great, quote unquote, great leaders. And in some respects, you either had those characteristics or you did not have those characteristics. Those things such as charisma, things such as persistence, those are considered to be characteristics of great leaders, and you kind of had them or you didn't have them. More recent leadership literature has found that there's no real statistically significant relationship between certain types of common traits and success at being a leader. In other words, leadership is not something you're necessarily born with. It is something that you can learn. And it's more a set of skills and a set of approaches that you can learn in order to enhance your leadership abilities. The leadership literature really traces most of its focus today back to the 1950s and what was known as the Ohio State studies. And the mid to late 1950s, we had the Ohio State University doing its leadership studies. Then a few years later, the University of Michigan started doing its own leadership studies, kind of modeled after what Ohio State had done. The Ohio State studies created this dichotomy of leaders between focus on structure versus focus on consideration for employees. So some leaders are more focused on structure and getting the job done and productivity, while other leaders are much more interested in fostering relationships with their employees and leading through considerate leadership, being considerate of the wants and needs of their employees. The Michigan study did the same type of thing with the same type of dichotomy, just changed the terminology a bit, looked at employee-oriented leaders versus production-oriented leaders. This focus on employee-oriented versus production-oriented is still used today by the modern leadership studies. So it's something that has really flowed through from the 50s and 60s to a contemporary period of time. We've all worked with leaders before who we figured were very charismatic in nature. And one type of leadership that the leadership studies have identified is charismatic leadership. Charismatic leaders, as we all know, are those leaders who kind of lead by personality. They lead by their charisma. They lead by kind of modeling to others what good leadership looks like. In charismatic leadership, there are basically two different approaches to charismatic leadership. And I think we've talked about this before in a previous class. There is what's known as attribution theory of charismatic leadership, and there is self-concept theory of charismatic leadership. In the attribution approach to charismatic leadership, people will follow a charismatic leader because they see characteristics on the part of that leader that they attribute with great leadership. So again, things like persistence, things such as, I hate to say thinking outside the box, but thinking in ways and acting in ways that is discrepant to the status quo, doing things in ways that have not been done before, not doing things just because we've always done it this way in the past. Those are things that people attribute to great leadership. So if they see those characteristics on the part of a charismatic leader, they're more likely to follow that leader. The self-concept type of charismatic leadership is people will follow leaders who they associate themselves with. So if they see some of themselves in this leader reminds them of themselves, they're going to be more likely to follow that charismatic leader. The advantage of charismatic leadership is that charismatic leadership creates very, very strong loyalty among followers. So followers will follow charismatic leaders essentially to the ends of the earth. The downside of charismatic leadership is that power and authority for charismatic leaders resides within the leader themselves, reside within the person as opposed to the office. People in organizations are sometimes temporary in that when leaders leave an organization, they will take their power base with them. So it's a very transient, very temporary type of leadership, very transient type of power. When power and authority resides instead in the office, that's a much more formal, much more permanent type of leadership. And so when it resides in the office, that type of power is going to stay within the organization. Then there are transactional leaders, and those are the leaders that Chester Barnard talked to us about. Those are kind of your brokers. These are leaders who will engage in these daily transactions with their employees. I need contributions from you, and to get these contributions, I will provide you with these incentives that you place a value upon. Then you have your transformational visionary types of leaders. Transformational leaders come into an organization with a vision. They come in with something that they want to try and accomplish, and then work toward the accomplishment of that vision. As we had said before, transformational leaders sometimes will burn through their political capital relatively quickly. So transformational leaders have to be very careful and really gauge the culture of the organization to know how hard to press in terms of getting their initiatives implemented within the organization. Where the literature has settled in terms of this debate between transactional and transformational leadership is in terms of contingency situational leadership. that at certain points in time, in certain situations, you need to be more transactional. While in other situations, at other points in time, you can be much more transformational. So whether you're transactional or transformational will certainly depend upon the context, the contingencies, and the situation in which you find yourself. Shouldn't be any surprise to us, this it depends type of methodology. Where this contingency situational leadership really is, I think, expressed very well is by William Redding and his 4 different styles of contingency-based leadership. So according to Redding, there are these 4 different styles of contingency-based leadership, again, based upon that old dichotomy first presented by Ohio State and Michigan. So you've got concern for people versus concern for productivity and performance. So at the bottom cell, the middle bottom, you have a laissez-faire leader. Laissez-faire leaders have a very low level of concern for productivity and performance, as well as a very low level of concern for employees. These laissez-faire types of leaders feel that people are uncontrollable. And so as a leader, you just kind of try and stay out of trouble and try and stay out of the situation and stay at arm's length from everyone and everything within the organization. This is, as we know from the Iowa studies, the worst type of leadership that you can have. Then above that, you have leaders who have a very high concern for employees, a relatively low concern for productivity. These are your human relations leaders. Sometimes they're referred to pejoratively as country club leaders. These country club human relations leaders focus on harmony. They focus on making their employees happy, engaging with their employees, forming relationships with their employees, even if that is done to the detriment of the performance and productivity of the organization. Bottom right, you have your autocratic leaders, low concern for people, high concern for productivity, relying upon authority and very top-down centralized type of management with very little employee involvement. We saw in the Iowa studies what that meant for the effectiveness of the decision-making of groups. And then at your top right-hand corner, probably your preferred place to be is Democratic leader. High concern for people as well as high concern for performance. Democratic leaders try to combine organization and personal goals to find that point of goal congruence in order to not only make the organization effective, but to make the organization a productive place for people to work and so that people really feel that they are in alignment with the organization. They have a home in the organization, kind of that esprit de corps, that team spirit that was talked about all the way back with Henri Fayol, probably back in our second week of classes. So where we are looking now in terms of studying organizations from a leadership perspective is very much in terms of contingency-based leadership. At certain points in time, leaders need to be more transactional in nature, and other points in time, they can be more transactional, but it really does depend upon the situation in which the organization finds itself at a current point in time. So to kind of wrap all of this up, a couple things I would like to illustrate to you to help wrap up everything that we've talked about with all these different theories and schools of thought over the past 5 weeks. One thing is that if you need refreshers on this, was if you're in the MPA program and you're getting prepared for 697 and to do your case study in organization theory in 697, if you can hold on to the Tompkins textbook, at the end of the Tompkins textbook in chapter 16, he does a very nice job of taking all of our different schools of thought and comparing all those different schools of thought in terms of the models of organizational effectiveness that they value, the mechanisms for coordination and control, as well as their methods for motivation. And that occurs at the back of the book between pages 397 and I believe page 401. So just for some handy reference, if you need to go back and review some of these schools of thought and how to compare them, that's a good way to do it. But more importantly, though, I think that the overarching arc, if you will, of the evolution and development of the organization theory literature is very much this movement away from the one-size-fits-all approach. With more modern theories, we have slowly but surely moved away from here's the best way to study organizations to here is the most appropriate way to study organizations based upon the context at that point in time. So very much this movement more toward an it depends type of approach to studying organizations. I think a second major trend that we have seen throughout the evolution of the organization theory literature is more of an emphasis and premium being placed upon employee involvement. All of our modern theories, whether it be participative management or whether it be quality management or whether it be organization culture, they all are predicated upon involving employees in their own self-determination and their own self-governance far more than what we saw back in the classical school. I think this evolution of the organization theory literature has really underscored the heightened need to include our employees more and more in the daily life of the organization. So hopefully what we have done here throughout the past 5 weeks is we provided for you a good overview of the organization theory literature and different perspectives on how to study public organizations. So you can now take this information and then apply it to your organization or apply it to an organization presented to you in the 697 case study. And as is the case with the entire MPA program, our primary goal is how can we take these theories and how can we then find the application of these theories in the quote real world of public administration and public organizations? And so hopefully that's something that we have done during our time together as a class. At this point, do you have any questions or observations or any clarifications in terms of any of these 4 quote unquote modern approaches to studying organizations? Alrighty, then I think that given the fact that it's 8:20, we don't have time to do the breakout groups, so we'll just forego the breakout groups for tonight. The exercise I was going to have you do in breakout groups is essentially the exercise you're doing in Canvas essay number 5. And so it's looking at your organization and kind of determining the environment of your organization, the type of system that your organization operates in, and then some examples to support which system you think your organization is in, a more open system versus a more natural or closed type of system. That wraps up all of our information that we are covering this term together. Again, next time we will do all presentations, so you don't have to hear me talk anymore. I get to listen to you talk. And I've already gotten a couple of requests in terms of the ordering of presentations. And so if you do want to go early next week, do get me that email as soon as you can, because our number 1 and 2 slots, I think, are already gone. And so they're going to be slipping away very quickly. They're informal presentations, less than 10 minutes each. And I think we'll have ample time, hopefully, fingers crossed, famous last words, to get through all 13 of our presentations next week without running over time. Then also your organizational analysis paper is due by midnight on next Wednesday, July 3rd, as well as your final assessment. Okay, if there's nothing else, thank you very much for being here tonight. We'll get out a few minutes early, and I look forward to reading your organizational analysis papers and your final assessments, and also look forward to hearing your presentations in class next week. So thanks, everyone. Have a great evening. Have a great remainder of the week. Thank you. Talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks for